Hi, everyone. Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. If you're not yet familiar with YIVO, welcome. We are a special place for the contemplation and celebration of Jewish history and culture. I encourage you to check out yivo.org to register for many upcoming events, such as this one, enroll in seminars, including English language seminars on Jewish history, and also explore YIVO's plentiful archives. Today's event is a book talk on the newly published work, An Unchosen People, Jewish Political Reckoning in Interwar Poland. I'd like to briefly introduce the author, who we have here today, Kenneth B Moss. He is the Harriet and Ulrich E. Meyer Professor of Jewish History in the college at the University of Chicago. He also authored Jewish Renaissance in the Russian Revolution, which won the Sammy Rohr Prize of the National Jewish Book Council. His work has appeared in quite a few languages: Yiddish, Hebrew, Polish, Russian, German, and Portuguese, as well as, of course, English. And today we are also fortunate to have Steven Zipperstein joining us. He is the Daniel E. Koshland Professor in Jewish History and Culture at Stanford University. He's the author and editor of 9 books, most recently Pogrom, Kishinev, and the Tilt of History. Thank you all for joining us. We're so glad to have you here with YIVO virtually. And I'll turn it over now to Kenneth to begin today's conversation.
Well, thank you, Jane. And thank you to the YIVO Institute, to Jane Tushinsky, to Alex Weiser, to Eddie Portnoy for making this possible. Of course, thanks to my teacher and mentor, Steve Zipperstein, for taking part in this. It's truly an honor to discuss An Unchosen People with Steve, who in some ways stands behind this book as he does, at least as an influence. We'll see if he stands behind it otherwise, as he does all my work. I also want to thank everyone in the audience for your attention. There's a lot competing for our attention. We've all had our minds on much more pressing things than the past in the present. I thank you for taking the time to be with me and to be with us here. And let me add that I genuinely would like to know what you think of An Unchosen People should you have a chance to read it. And I'd be delighted to hear from you. So I'm told I should begin with a sketch of some of the book's main arguments, and I begin with a quote. Even Trotsky has begun to believe that Hitler will remain in power some 10 to 20 years. That which has happened in Germany with its relatively small Jewish community is only a hint of the catastrophe that will break out in those lands where Jews make up a population of millions. By the time the storms finally grow still, the Jewish people will be crushed and broken. End quote. This dark vision of the future that awaited Poland's 3 million Jews and their nearly 2 million co-religionists in Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Hungary was not voiced in 1939, but in October 1933, in one of Warsaw's few politically independent Yiddish journals, by a Vilna Jewish university student calling himself Michal Oster. And Oster added to this grim vision a harsh message to his fellow Polish Jews. None of the political ideologies that Polish Jews might be banking on were likely to have much effect on their fate, at least not collectively. To those who urged Polish Jews to, quote, carry on the old politics, end quote, of fighting for Jewish well-being in Poland's parliament, municipalities, and streets, Oster scoffed. It was delusion to think that any variety of political effort by 10% of Poland's population of some 30 million people could have much effect on how Poland's polity, much less all of Europe, would choose to solve the Jewish problem. Any lingering hopes that the international community would protect Jews merited only, quote, a bitter smile at the naive ideas of the Jewish liberals who believe that the world is becoming more humanitarian, end quote. Was the answer then revolution? Oster was a committed Marxist, but he saw the approach of the two dominant forces in Polish Jewish socialism, the Social Democratic Bund and the communists, as telling Jews to, quote, wait with our hands in our pockets until the social revolution comes, end quote. Finally, Oster drew the consequences of his grim judgments quite bluntly, quote, if we take as given that we cannot hope for an improvement in Jewish life in the diaspora, we must seek another path, end quote. In our histories of the modern Jewish experience, and in our reflections on that history's larger significance, what place is merited by thought like Oster's? I think that many of my fellow Jewish historians worry that framing Jewish history with thought like his threatens to impose a teleology that prevents serious attention to whole worlds of Jewish life, thought, and creativity. We all know, of course, that grim visions of Jewish futurelessness in Eastern Europe, like Oster's, were hardly rare at the time. But my fellow historians will tell you, and rightly, that such views as his were far from universal. masses of Jews continued to aspire to integration as Poles, or envision revolution, or remain committed to religious piety and hopes in divine providence. Ordinary Jews sought mightily to carve out fulfilling lives. So what claim should the Osters have on our historical imagination exactly? For myself, at the very beginning of this project, as I began to read through the many, many sources testifying to a spreading sense of futurelessness among Polish Jews, I shared the uncertainty as to how to construe their importance. I had the sense of being stuck with equally unsatisfying pseudo-analytical choices to call the Osters prophets or dismiss them as pessimists, a term I hope we will never use again after this talk. But what I came to see, and what first began to convince me that there was a history here that deserved to be revisited, was that among the Osters of Poland, many were anything but unreflective pessimists. Rather, they were thinking people trying urgently to understand what was going on around them. In late 1933, a woman named Miriam Shalev came to Poland as an emissary from Jewish Palestine's kibbutz movement to help get a handle on an unanticipated influx of tens of thousands of young Polish Jews into Zionist organizations. As Shalev traversed southern Poland from Krakow eastward to small towns like Kolki and Osowa in the Rovno region, what she found both upset and impressed her. She was upset to find that many of these young Zionists were indifferent to Zionist myths and visions of the new Jew, even cynical. But Shalev was impressed by the intellectual intensity with which they sought knowledge about their world, quote, an answer to their many questions, end quote. Right. They read widely and argued seriously about Poland's and Europe's trajectories, Palestine's possibilities, the sources of ethnic strife, quote, the sources of anti-Semitism, end quote. Shalev's report is one of many sources that, taken together, pointed me to a quiet revolution in the character of Jewish political thinking at the grassroots. A significant number of Polish Jews were moving both toward profound skepticism about old ideologies and toward a keen drive to really understand the processes taking shape around them. So what do we find by taking the thought of the Osters and the observations of the Shalevs seriously? An Unchosen People argues that we find ourselves witness to a quiet but deep transformation of Polish Jewish social thought and political reason in the face of rising ethno-nationalism, festering anti-Semitism, and the unexpected weakness of liberal ideals and institutions. And we find some Jews reckoning not only with rising political danger, but also with a dawning recognition of Jews' own relative collective powerlessness to do much about any of this in any way that could possibly help all or even most in the community win a chance at a better future. An Unchosen People is above all an exploration of some new species of Jewish analysis and endeavor that began to emerge at the fraught intersection of these two basic recognitions, that Jews actually had quite limited capacity to shape the course of Poland's or Europe's trajectory, and that there was ever more reason to fear that that trajectory presented grave dangers. So one part of the book turns to intellectual history, to the painful and partial recasting of Jewish understandings of the nation state, minorityhood, anti-Semitism, and political rationality. I focus here on renegade thinkers in both the Zionist and the diasporist camps who looked past reassuring progressive truisms that things were sort of getting better somehow, and past Marxist certainties about the dialectic to try to make better sense of the unexpected powers of anti-Jewish myth in Europe, the changing relationship between mass politics and the choices of political elites, and illiberal nationalism's unexpected capacity to redefine the terms of public life, even in semi-functional democracies. Wrestling with why hostility to Jews should become such a political power, some of these thinkers turn to theories of psychopathology, but others move toward much more structural intuitions about what could go wrong for minorities in nation states and why. And some began to ask whether explanation was an adequate aim or whether they also had to engage in prediction to offer some kind of guidance to their fellow Polish Jews as to where their situation was likely to go. A second part of the book offers a revisionist history of Yiddishism and diasporism, telling not the familiar stories of defiant revolutionaries fighting bravely for a better tomorrow, although those are important stories, but of how some diasporist activists, scholars, and poets wrestled with a growing sense that the East European Jewish self was being undermined by emerging forms of negative identity born of stigmatization and powerlessness. Some, like YIVO's founder, Max Weinreich, became informed, if reluctant, participants in a comparative sociology of global minorityhood. He began to think about Polish Jewish subjectivity in relation to African-American experiences of violent exclusion, among others. Others, like the poet Chaim Grada, sought ways to shore up the embattled Jewish self, given that Jews could not change the conditions pressing upon them. In other words, for Grada, the vaunted ideal of creating a new Yiddish culture, something that I focused much of my work on in my first book, gave way to the very terrifying sense that perhaps culture could only serve as a kind of psychic first aid. The third and longest part of the book turns away from intellectual and cultural history to the grassroots of Polish Jewish life, especially among young people, to think about new forms of political reckoning with danger and incapacity. I comb through sources like Miriam Shalev's on grassroots political thinking to recover what I call a culture of inquiry, in which true belief in ideology gives way to genuine efforts to understand the world better and to understand what's happening around one. Much more concretely, I also trace a shift, quite a dramatic shift, I think, in the kind of relationship that many Polish Jews had to Zionism and to the perhaps unique Jewish national community it was shaping in Palestine, the Yishuv. Between 1932 and 1936, when an unexpected British reopening of Palestine rendered it the world's most open destination for Jewish immigrants, Polish Jewry became, I argue, one of the first Jewries to engage en masse less with Zionism as an idea which one could embrace or criticize, than with the Yishuv as a fact and a potential. Debates about Zionism that had pivoted on issues of identity and ideology became instead, for many, an inquiry about where Jews, or at least some, or maybe just a few, or maybe just one's children, were most likely to find a chance at a decent life by the mid-1930s. Finally, my last chapter investigates the painful emergence of new forms of Jewish political rationality defined by emergency, renunciation, and triage. Under the pressure of the belief that Jews faced imminent danger that they could do nothing much to avert, some Polish Jews groped toward the unhappy sense that political reason meant putting aside ideals and hopes, including cherished ones, even putting aside one's own identity, to ask coldly what, if anything, could be done to improve some Jews' lives and life chances. Within the space of this kind of thinking, it became possible, I argue, to grapple consequentially with a series of tightly linked propositions, none of them happy-making. Exit from Poland might be the only consequential way of really improving Jewish lives. The fact that exit was hard to find did not render this less true. There was no realistic chance of finding a happy solution for Polish Jewry as a whole, much less one that Jews could affect through their own agency. Therefore, it followed, however much one believed in the value of community or one's obligations to it, to better one's own life chances might require seizing individual opportunities and leaving the community to its fate. So to conclude, this is a book that tries to take seriously the shaping power of the Jewish question in Jewish life, and therefore Jewish thought and politics. I think we have to make a place for those Jewish voices that tried harder than others to understand phenomena indifferent to their will and yet decisive for their fate. So thank you, and I very much look forward to our conversation following upon this.
And thank you very much. So many history books are structured with the use of a chronological grid. Yours is and isn't. And there's a conceptual grid of the sort that you just outlined. But I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about how you arrived at the way in which you've structured this book, how it evolved over time, and how you came to write a book so unlike most other books that I can think of that deal with Jewish political culture, how you ended up writing a book whose main theme is futurelessness. And so what if we begin with that cluster of questions?
Thank you, Steve, for that question. I mean, I'm flattered by the notion this book is very different, although I might say I think there's a certain way in which most books about the 1930s do maybe tarry in a certain kind of notional single space and time, single chronotope, right? mostly, I think they try to escape that chronotope by trying to point to lost possibilities or submerged possibilities or forgotten kinds of openness. But I'll take the compliment that it's a peculiar kind of book, and it is. I guess I would say that I'm not sure how to answer your question, as it were, genetically in terms of the course of my own thought in what was a very long period of time for the gestation and creation of this book. I think that one thing that I would like to just reemphasize from my opening conversation or opening presentation is to say that I am interested in people who lost their faith that they knew where history was going, if they'd ever had it. We're not open to easy answers as to that, or reassuring answers as to that, but also didn't know what to do about it. And so in some sense, I think every individual appears in the book is initiating the same conversation with him or herself, and then increasingly with others, from the same standpoint of suddenly realizing that the world around them is moving in directions they find terribly alarming, and it's very hard to know what to do about it, and none of the obvious answers long on offer, at least from the 20s and perhaps even from the 1890s, really make much difference. Another way to put this too is that this is not a book that tarries in one movement. The actors I ended up working on in this book, and this is my excuse for why it took so damn long, they are self-selecting in the sense they are all people who begin to feel a new skepticism about their earlier assumptions, and also to feel to believe that the analytical tools that they had inherited from Jewish and other East European intellectual settings of the 1920s, the 19-teens, the aughts, are inadequate to understand the world around them, perhaps because the world itself has changed. And so oftentimes, particularly the more intellectual historical dimensions of the book, I'm watching people try to both get a handle on a situation and jerry-rig a set of analytical tools to even begin to make sense of how, for instance, you think about noisy kinds of dangers that, if they were to come true, would be terrifying, but it's very hard to know if they will. The most obvious being various kinds of very pointed and aggressive anti-Semitism. And then the last thing I'll say, although there are many other worries that actually come to occupy much more central parts of their thought, the last thing I'll say is that, and this is not so much an answer as an emphasis on the peculiarity of the book is set during a relatively quiet period in terms of grand politics for Polish Jews. I mean, it's set in the era of Pilsudski's rule. And indeed, as all of my actors recognize, that's a relatively quiet setting, at least politically, in part because this increasingly semi-authoritarian state is fairly good in the short term at partially suppressing political threats, both from its left and, more importantly and more menacingly, from Jews from its right. It's certainly a much quieter and better place to be for Jews than Germany after 1933. And so a lot of my figures feel themselves to be living in a stable setting, although it's also a setting increasingly ravaged by the Depression. So, but also watching around them the emergence of all kinds of social tensions and pathologies, that actually are political, but in the larger society, and not knowing how to develop a calculus of whether this state can hold out against it, to what degree it's going to try, and it turns out not to try very hard, and under what circumstances all of these visible dangers actually will coalesce into something fundamentally very threatening.
One reason it seems to me why the book took as long as it did, and I'm not suggesting it took longer than it should have, is that my sense is that you really came to know these figures. You're a conversant with them. This one of the ways in which this book is so unusual. And it's not as if your presence in the book deflects or weakens it as an historical study. I think it actually strengthens it. And one aspect that struck me, and I'd be curious to hear whether you were struck by this as well, is that a good many of the protagonists you speak about, Weinreich, Lewczynski, others, are people I thought I knew. but they are so immeasurably more interesting and intellectually variegated on your pages than I ever suspected before, to some part of the incredible sense of loss that I was left with in finishing the book is that as much, even though the thrust of their talk is fundamentally pessimistic and resigned on some level, it's a richer Jewish conversation than I ever would have imagined occurring at the time, and one of the richest Jewish conversations of the 20th century, and so much richer than one will encounter in the mid-late 1940s and 50s, once this world is obliterated. And so I was left with both a sense of awe at how much more impressive these otherwise seemingly familiar people are than I ever would have imagined, and a sense of profound loss at the obliteration of the world that they were wrestling with, and the way in which they ended up being, if you will, in its wake, if they survived, rather marginalized. One known as a linguist, one known as a statistician, when their intellectual girth was so much more expansive.
Well, I will say, just on a personal note, I'm pleased on their behalf to hear that, in the sense that I certainly think that insofar as, I came to identify, I don't think I went into it not identifying with them, but I came to identify very deeply with these people precisely in their quest to make some sense of their situation. And I tried, and I think that let me read sympathetically, in the sense that I'm not sure any of them, there's a sport we historians have, and it's a healthy sport for the sake of knowledge, to sort of find great thinkers who have been overlooked. I don't know that any of these people had the luxury of thinking systematically all the thoughts they should think through to the end, or even that they necessarily wanted to. So, Weinreich's a fascinating figure for whom, and I spent a year circling around his incredibly unsettling, for all sorts of reasons, discussions of African-American life as he had seen it and read about it. And yet realizing that there's some very interesting and provocative rethinking of his own assumptions about who Jews were there, because he had wanted Jews to be, as it were, the same kind of nation that Poles and Greeks and so forth had been. Those are the comparisons he reaches for early in one of his works. And instead he's wondering, in fact, if he's not watching something hard to define take shape in a community that wishes to belong to something but feels that that its presence is much resented and it's not welcome. But not having much else to reach for, he thinks, in terms of what he calls compensations. And it's a very fractured and problematic, first of all, it's a very fractured and problematic way of thinking about African Americans, but it's also a very, very fragmented way of thinking about Jews. And yet, he's a figure who in some sense was my Virgil for this project, although in the sense to invoke a very different discursive order. Because I could see him wrestling with his own assumptions. Another way you see that is, and this was maybe a text that does help me understand where this book came from. Very early in the process of working on this, I found a travelogue. I don't think I was the first to find it. I think actually Gennady Estreich mentions it somewhere, but I read a travelogue that he writes of a trip. No, in fact, I saw a reference to it on the walls of the YIVO Institute back when one could still go into buildings. There was a display, and it showed up the outline of a talk Weinreich was going to give in Vilna upon his return from his first trip to Palestine.
Interesting idea of actually those of us who work at YIVO actually write annotations on the walls, but go on.
Yeah, well, it was hung on the walls, a copy. And Weinreich, he writes, if you read his work just before he goes, at the close of Weg zur Jugend, his great strange prolegomenon to a study of Polish Jewish youth sociology and social psychology, he still can only think of Zionism from the standpoint of a bitter enemy of it at the ideological level. And it's not that he becomes a convinced Zionist when he goes to Palestine. It's that the whole register of the travelogue pushes to aside all of the previous questions he'd asked and ask a different question that spotlights a different way of thinking, which is to ask, as a diaspora nationalist worried about Jews, including presumably his own 2 children, what do I see in the Yishuv that speaks to whether any of Zionism's actual political claims, that this is building a better place for some Jews, stand up under scrutiny, distinct from all of its myths, right? And you can really see him trying to think that through and getting somewhere toward a much more complex and mediated relationship, not to the ideological claims, not to the cultural claims of this movement, but to what it might offer to some of the people that he had previously seen as sort of following its siren song. And so that kind of thing, I thought, was really, that helped me. That was the kind of thinking I wanted to dwell in on a whole variety of issues. People who felt compelled and were intellectually able, ideologically able maybe, to rethink their most cherished assumptions and commitments.
So you make an argument about a certain degree of consensus in an otherwise seemingly profoundly fractured community, fractured in all kinds of ways. Just if you could just walk us through a bit, just briefly, how you actually came to understand this notion of consensus, a kind of consensual way of thinking under the surface in what you're excavating. You used the term excavation at one point as a description of what you're doing. Excavation also takes a while, right? And so beneath a surface, on the surface, a utterly fractious community, where, for example, the Bund seems to be in municipal politics and elsewhere on the ascendancy, you discover something that otherwise doesn't seem all that visible, but at the same time that you're able to demonstrate, it seems to me quite persuasively. Can you just talk about just the process of what it means to actually make sense of something that on the surface, well, doesn't seem to exist?
Well, let me maybe overly specify what I think you mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in some sense, I think the consensus to which you make reference is a shared widening sense that prospects for the future look grim, no matter what various people say. Is that
it's not working out.
It's not working out.
Simply not working out. Yeah. And that there may be other alternatives, not terribly attractive, somewhat grim, in a humid, hot climate, for example, that may be better, even if you're not by any means ideologically persuaded that they're right.
Okay, I guess I'll say this. If I were to go on the offensive against some imagined set of debate partners, I would say I think part of the sense that this is not visible is an artifact of an historiography that, for good reasons, has been really interested in the true believers of all sorts. But one does not actually have to look all that hard to find people saying the vast majority, a large majority, a quite substantial cross-section of this, that, and the other set of Polish Jews are full of fear, worry, and doubt about the future. And you see that, this just putting a source to a source. I spent a lot of time just gathering those sources. Sometimes you find that in the archives, but sometimes you find it, in plain sight. Come back to Weinreich, this figure who, again, was in some ways my Virgil. He says exactly that, and he's the last person who wants to admit it. If you read a couple hundred pages into Weg zur Jugend, right, which is like, it's kind of a schlep. He actually says, insofar as he wants to be pinned down as to what he thinks is happening, he says basically, Jewishness is now experienced. He uses a strange word. He doesn't use Onfall. He uses an attack, a psychic woe that befalls all young people, and it does so only. It does so in ways that you can kind of push back against up to a point, and he has a kind of Yiddishist agenda, as Kamil Kiak pointed out in a very interesting reading of the text. There's a polemical dimension. He wants to say, look, only Yiddishism, only giving these kids their own culture something to be proud of rather than letting them try and assimilate and get slapped in the face, only that can give them something other than a sense of woe and powerlessness. And I'm very partial to that view. I'm not, but Weinreich doesn't actually think that's all that convincing for most people. He says most Jewish kids inevitably will feel their Jewishness as something that dooms them to a future. It doesn't doom them. It means that their future is likely foreclosed in all sorts of ways that no one really likes, and maybe worse than that. And you know, I started looking around. Leszczynski, at the moment that he actually is a Bundist, he's very peripatetic, but in the late 20s, he's a Bundist because the Bund connects his vision of how the dialectical process of capitalism's immolation will in some way recast the Jews in the Eastern European setting as a Yiddish nation. He does a tour of Poland for months, and his basic view is when you really talk to most Jews, and he's talking to a different set of Jews than Weinreich, not kids, but adults. He says they've been beset by a panic mood and a pogrom mood. He doesn't like this. He's not saying I told you so. He's saying everyone's desperate, and that's bad. That's not good for the community. So there's so many of those sources. And I think once you look at enough of those, you realize, I'm not sure I'd say there's a consensus. I tried to give due to the very different kinds of sensibilities that were out there in my second chapter, which is sort of the most social historical, let's say. There were absolutely Bundist and communist true believers. There were people for whom their belief meant they really did not experience this despair. There's this fascinating figure that people on this call, whatever their language skills, can read his autobiography, a figure who called himself Greno, wrote one of these 1934 Evo autobiographies. He became a hardcore communist, a kind of real thought leader, if you will, in both senses of the word, in the communist sense, in his local community, went to jail. He experiences anti-Semitic and in general things that would sap people's sense that things are going to work out well over and over. And it just reinforces his faith. And going to jail, he finally actually meets, as he himself says, he finally meets all of the non-Jewish Poles that he's been dreaming of. They're fellow communist prisoners. He says some of them professors, tall and healthy, because he's poor kid. He's really from a poor background. Who knows what his health was like? And they're teaching him what he wants to know. They're teaching about the revolution, the way it should be studied. So I'm not suggesting that there was talk and then there was this deep consensus. What I am suggesting is that when you look at a lot of different kinds of sources, not just about talk, but also choice, lots of people are leaving the Bund, Orthodox circles, and assimilationist circles and coming to Zionist ones all at once. And as the Zionists themselves admit, it's not because they read Beryl Katznelson and were inspired by the idea of creating a new life. There were people like that too, but it's because they're desperate and looking for something that can give them a future.
So, could you, apropos of the Leszczynski quote, beset by a pogrom mood and a panic mood. All of us, we try to write about the past, of course, live in the present. And can you just speculate about the way in which a somewhat more unsettled present inflected in any way the way in which you wrote this book? And I'll just end the question there. I'll follow up in a moment.
Yeah, I think I'm not only do I have no desire to deny the very deep impact of the present, but I also think it was actually the deep impact of our very troubled present proved incredibly illuminating. I mean, it's a truism which is true, but can be true in two very different senses, that we historians write about the past through the lens of the present. And I think that's usually meant to say that if you dig deep enough, this is all a kind of puppet theater behind which our presentist concerns are lurking. And I'm not suggesting you're saying at all by any means, but I think what you and I agree on is that in the best case, and we're not all always at our best, the present shows us some things about the potential of people and institutions and polities and cultures that we hadn't necessarily known before. And we actually can find them because they were really there, but they were hard to articulate. And the other reason this book really only gelled, I think, in the last 5 years has a lot. I mean, in some ways, it began as a book about culture, about how people who had wanted to have a sort of national renaissance, people in my first book, if you will, were wrestled with the possibility that they wouldn't have that. They might have something less pleasant than that, for, one marked by exclusion. But it became a book about how easily at least semi-democratic institutions and semi-functional mixed polities can spin out of control, how easily small and maybe not so small groups of people filled with animosity or fear and rage and demands about the way their state's not meeting their needs can take over a polity and capture a political process, and about how hard it is for people of whatever their background in politics to figure out how seriously to take any of that or what you should do about it. I mean, there is no question to my mind that I saw those things because of the last 5 years, much more clearly than before. But unfortunately, I think they were also true of the people I studied.
Is there a turn, as you see it, on the part of Jewish historians to wrestle more with unsettling features of the past than Jewish historians have over the course of the last couple of generations, influenced inordinately perhaps by Sela Baron's lachrymose criticism of the lachrymose conception of Jewish history? And do you see a trend? And it's an open-ended question. I don't know whether I do or I don't, but your book, Alyssa Ben-Porat's work, Jeffrey Weidlinger's new book, my last book, and works written by historians who would not have necessarily probed the kinds of issues that they're now probing. And is there anything to say about this aside from the fact that, these are all in one way or another perhaps interesting books? Are they operating within a certain kind of zeitgeist? And if so, what would you say about that?
Well, I think, the first thing to say, of course, is that sociological juice for the goose is sociological juice for the gander, sauce for the gander, right? I mean, so we can always, we will be judged as a group. Those 4 books and many others will certainly be seen as part of a zeitgeist, much as the books that they seem to stand in a certain kind of tension with, animated by a Benjaminian sensibility that I very much admire and hope to preserve in some way, about wanting to brush history against the grain, find alternatives to, exclusionary ethno-nationalism.
Let's interject, Ken. The alternative that so many of us focused on for years was the alternative to a focus on constant woe. That was the alternative. Arthur Hertzberg's unkind quip, there's no business like Shoah business. That represented the alternative. Now, This is an alternative to the alternative.
Yes, this is an alternative. That's right. I'd say a couple more preliminaries. First of all, I'd say there's certainly one field of Jewish history where much of the energy, for better and for worse, but not only one or the other, I think, has been directed toward uncovering a past we find unnerving and unhappy, and that's, of course, work on Israel and Palestine. And that's, of course, as you know, been going on. I mean, that has shifted quite dramatically for reasons that have everything to do with our present, in perhaps both the ways I just laid out what that might mean. I think that East European Jewish history and German Jewish history and the history of the Jews of the Near East, of the Arab world, have all been pulled toward the alternative to the lachrymose quite dramatically. And at this point, I think if you look about what gets coverage and attention in the serious popular press, it's only work, right, broadly, almost only work, with perhaps an exception of your book, actually, which is great, that is really anxious, committed to finding some other alternative to just nastiness and conflict in the past. And I want to say I'm not an enemy of that work. I mean, my first book, was a book about people who really believed it'd be possible to build a new Hebrew and or Yiddish culture And they were wrong about a lot of things, but they actually built it. I mean, so I'm not suggesting that we should. I'm not suggesting that the impulse to say, what was when Baron was attacking the kind of Gretzian, Leiden und Lernen, Jews suffer and they study. And obviously, I mean, first of all, that's just not a very good way of thinking about the complexity of anyone's lives. And the fact that we have this vast, rich vision and account of Jewish life in so many places is largely thanks to that anti-lachrymose view. And so, that also means that certain things are harder to talk about and have been missed. And I think I'm not trying to say there was only one Jewish modernity and it was actually lachrymose. I'm saying that there were many lines of experience in Jewish modernity, but there was also a fundamental structure of powerlessness and threat that some Jews thought about sometimes. And it seems crazy that we can't write their history. Not because we should be lachrymose, but because that's an essential dimension of our modern experience.
So let me say this in conclusion, and I hesitate only slightly because I was, as you've acknowledged, your teacher, and there is such a thing as inflated letters of recommendation. All of us have read them on occasion. Some of us have written them. It seems to me that this is a highly unusual book, that there are those books that are admirable scholarly achievements that impress us with their erudition and their persuasiveness. And then there's a book like yours that's all of that, but that also continues to haunt once you finish it and close its pages. And the questions, in a sense, it's a book, as I see it, that ends in mid-sentence and is all the more impressive as a result. And rarely have I read a book where I felt the reader was in such empathetic conversation with the book's participants, the book's figures. And you're right there in the pages, Ken. And I closed this book feeling somewhat haunted, but also just enormously impressed. And I think now we're ready for comments and questions.
Thank you, Steve.
Sure. So if anyone interested has not submitted a question, you're welcome to type it in the Q&A function on the bottom of our Zoom here. I'll start out with a question that we heard from the audience. Can Professor Moss explain why he hopes we jettison the term pessimistic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a way to not think about these people as thinking people. And I'll say something a little more compromising than that. There are reams of sources I do not treat in this book that read as simply kind of mythopoetic pessimism, which has its own, that is to say, they're not terribly interested in understanding, or perhaps they forego the difficult and perhaps unrewarding effort to understand, say, the sociological realities playing out that may be very dangerous or may not be, or may wreak this kind of havoc and not that, should the following happen, but rather simply recur to and revert to modes of thinking about the world as, as always undergoing the opposite of progress, right? And just as I'm not terribly interested in this book in people for whom progressive or dialectical materialist understandings of the world substituted for thought and armored them against doubt, I'm not terribly interested in people who just sort of invoke these Spenglerian or for that matter, traditional Jewish ways of talking about, disaster, being chosen for disaster, including people I am interested in. I mean, Zeli Kalmanovich, is a figure about whom Josh Karlov has written important work, and he's a figure who attracts a certain kind of fascination for the way in which, from someone who seems ostensibly secular, he kind of moves into a way of thinking about the world that it comes to essentially understand it as Jews calling to suffer, perhaps, and there's a ton of that kind of material that I didn't get into because I'm not terribly interested in it, and I wanted to say something else, which is that there were people who deserve our respect and attention as people trying to figure out what was going on. And to call that pessimism is simply a way of not acknowledging its sociological specificity in terms of the sociology of knowledge, and not acknowledging them as people no more stupid than we are. So I think that's the answer.
Maybe as sort of a follow-up then, another question from the audience. Does Professor Moss's analysis apply equally to more cosmopolitan Jews, particularly in Warsaw, and to Jews who were, to the audience's word, more closely tied to Jewish tradition?
That's a great question. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I really thought was the answer to that. As with so many other phenomena and all the phenomena I study in this book, the answer is always sort of yes to every alternative possibility. And it becomes a kind of question of proportions and distinct sorts of sociologies. One thing that is very clear is that a great number of more Polonized Jews were very open to concern about their future. And some of the sources of the time actually argue that they are more open to despairing of their earlier hopes and commitments on the whole than, say, Hasidic Jews. And I did not ultimately in this book want to stake any really robust, essentially quantitative claims about which percent of what subgroup thought X and Y. But clearly a non-negligible proportion of the people flowing into pioneer Zionism organizations, which meant that organizations most likely to get you a fairly inaccessible certificate to actually get to Palestine, rather than organizations demanded fully robust sorts of thought about which Zionism you were committed to. A substantial proportion of them came from either homes that were striving to assimilation, based, for instance, on high school attendance, or from assimilated homes. Now, there are figures from the assimilationist or Polonized camp who push back against this argument, certainly, and say that there were always robust, there remained robust settings in which young people, for instance, at Warsaw University, 1/3 of Warsaw University students of Jewish background declare themselves Poles on the sort of identity cards of Warsaw University. So no question that many of those people were absolutely committed to remaining Poles. But there are so many sources from both small towns and big cities that suggest that these were not regional, much less provincial forms of political disillusionment and reorientation. There may very well have been differences in degree, right? So I'm perfectly open to the view that Jews in the Northwest and the impoverished and largely non-Polonized Northwestern provinces who had far less, they could even just not even imagine really having access to whatever more narrow Polish future might await them as individuals. I'm perfectly willing to imagine that they were more likely to veer toward these sort of politics of exit, as I call them. But then you have a source like there's a shaliach, a kibbutz movement. I use a lot of these sources because they always register when they see something they find kind of disturbing they didn't expect. And one of the most articulate of these figures, a figure named Lavita, comes in 29. He starts in the Northwest provinces in the Białystok region. And he finds there huge numbers of young people just flowing into Zionism, not for the reasons he likes, but because they want to get out. And they see no future in Poland. Although he has an interesting gendered comment about, he sees the girls as much more idealistic than the boys. We might come back to that. But then he travels southwest and he comes through places where he says, people are so Polonized here that the young people in my talks couldn't always understand any Yiddish. But they're making the same decision that they have no future here and they want to join and get out. So that's the kind of source that tells me that although it's certainly worth asking about these sort of sociologically local questions, we shouldn't assume that people's political choices are fully or even robustly hedged by their cultural differences. And then we have also direct, Alexander Hertz, looking back, if you read deeply inside his wonderful book on Polish Jews, Polonized Polish Jews, Poles of the Mosaic Persuasion. He actually says, from his standpoint, his circle of Poles in Poland were much more likely to be despairing by the mid-30s than before, certainly. And there's other sources that suggest that too. So enough reason to think it's substantial, even though it may very well be that the premise of the question is not false, that there's something being Polonized could give you some more reason to continue to hope to be part of Poland.
We have a question from Dr. Mark Kaplan. He says, in what sense is Professor Moss's understanding of Jewish politics in the 1930s analogous to contemporary theories of Afro-pessimism?
Well, a scholar I respect very highly actually says that about the book, but I wouldn't. I think for the reasons that far be it for me to suggest that I'm as informed about the body of work that goes under the term Afro-pessimism as I should be. My understanding, and maybe I'm simply misunderstanding it, but my understanding is that where the rubber meets the road in a lot of Afro-pessimist thought is to say that the category of Blackness is sort of permanently wedged into Western thought at all levels, from philosophical systems on down to very many dimensions of everyday life and institutions, as the thing that is sort of irredeemable and stands in for, what some might wish to expunge from themselves. And unfortunately, I think that's not a ridiculous argument about that phenomenon. That's a very disturbing thing, and one we should all dwell on quite seriously. The equivalent to that in the Jewish case would be something like Kalmanovich, actually, I think, which would be to say that, the Jews are in some sense, whether I believe in God or not, the Jews are in some sense chosen for this kind of exilic, or they play this. You also see this actually in the thinking of not Yechezkel Kaufman, but who was it in Palestine, writing in Hebrew, writing about anti-Semitism in a very mythopoetic mode, where he basically says, Christianity needs, and Christianity and everything it has given birth to needs the Jew, and sort of endlessly recuperates the Jew as the source of evil and the target of its hatred. And so in a way, of course, it's going to work out that way. I'm not saying I'm confident that there's no shred of truth in that, and unfortunately, and B, I'm not saying it didn't even make its way into some of the thought I'm looking at, but many of the figures I was looking at don't particularly look to a kind of deep structure of anti-Jewish thought and sentiment to explain why they're worried about where Poland's going to go. And in fact, they don't. That's also worth noting. Many of them, the ones I look at, don't actually see Poland as particularly anti-Semitic. It's not, it's not a, what is it? Yitzhak Shamir said that, maybe it was Begin, that Poles drink anti-Semitism with their mother's milk or something. That is not at all what the social scientists I'm looking at thought. They were very aware and very worried about what they thought were non-negligible and growing and spreading kinds of anti-Jewish sentiment, but they weren't altogether sure that sentiment was always the obvious thing to think about. They were also worried about what it means to be living in a nation state where the elite of which was not uniformly anti-Semitic by any means, and many of whom were genuinely committed to a view that they could both serve the interests of the Polish nation, finally restored independence, and the interests and needs of the 40% of people in the country who are not Poles. But it turns out it's really hard to do that, and it's especially hard to do that if a substantial part of your population thinks the state's really for them. And I would say that is not true by any means only of interwar Poland. It might be true of some states we can think of today. So,
do you want to elaborate a tiny bit on that sentence?
Well, right now that I've put my foot in all sorts of things, why not just jump right into another real mire? Yeah, I think they're thinking about what it means to have a nation state that says it can be both democratic and committed to the particular commonweal of a particular people, abused and disadvantaged by history. And certainly I had in mind sometimes writing this strange parallels that we want to investigate between Poland and contemporary Israel. But I'll say this, not only am I not an historian of Israel in this book, although I would like to go there in my future work, nor am I really trying to make all that robust a claim about what was really happening in the upper reaches of the Polish government and its thought. There are a lot of historians much better equipped to do that than I am, but I was interested in people who were, with a rather limited knowledge they could get access to, trying to understand what can happen to nation states, regardless of the hostility or goodwill, or at any rate, lack of ill will, as they would usually put it, of the state. And you can see them discussing exactly how to think about that problem. So Alter Druyanov comes from Palestine, is an old Russian Zionist, deeply rooted in Eastern Europe, full of love for East European Jewry. He's most famous now as a street name, but also in Tel Aviv, but also as he's only remembered by contemporary Israelis as having put together a multi-volume, wonderful collection of Jewish humor,
right.
Translated into Hebrew. But he comes, spends 6 months. He wants to understand what's going on. He spends a lot of time talking to folks in the older folks more in the traditional camp, as well as in the Zionist camp. And he talks a lot to the leading Zionist figures of the country. And he reports a big debate between the Galician Zionists, and one we know about from Ezra Mendelsohn, and the Galician Zionists and the Warsaw Zionist leadership. The Warsaw Zionist leadership thinks that basically there really is substantial anti-Jewish ill will, or sort of intentional anti-Jewish sensibility playing out in Sanatsia policy increasingly. And the Galician Zionists don't. But they all agree that it kind of doesn't matter. It's sort of a distinction without a difference, because whatever the elite feels, it can't be seen in the midst of a depression under incredibly difficult circumstances where 4.5 million Poles don't have any work as bending over backwards to help the Jews. Right? And that's very distant from Judeo-pessimism. That's a kind of analysis of political sociology.
Well, we're just about out of time, but one last question that you've already touched on is connecting to current events of today. Are there any specific takeaways from your book or research in general that could help the Jews of Ukraine specifically, and all Jews, cope with how to live as Jews while maintaining their particular national identity?
I hate to end on a profoundly negative note, but no, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think, I don't think there are many lines of affiliation between the experience, the particular structures of experience of Polish Jews and more generally East European Jews. 10% of the population regionally, 40 to 50% of the urban population, or 30 to 40% of the urban population regionally, 20 to 50% of what passed for the middle classes, albeit in declining sectors in a lot of places. Truly a middleman minority, and endangered by certain things that probably we might want to think about in those terms. In other ways, I think they tell us something about minority experience under duress. And I think that one of the strange aspects of contemporary Jewish life in Eastern Europe is that there isn't much of it, although I hope for its flourishing, of course. And I'm not really sure what it means to say that Jews are a substantial minority in Eastern Europe anymore. So I just don't know that I think there's so many and I also don't know what it means to read my book. And I wish it could offer some insights here, perhaps my first book, but maybe not this one, about what I think is essentially a cultural dimension of your question, which is, how does one balance wanting to be a participant in two kinds of life? These are questions that I think we have the luxury of still entertaining in the US. And I wrote a book about people who thought about this very hard about 10 years or 15 years earlier than where this book touches down. But I don't know that this book, in some ways, this book is about people who think that culture too might just be a luxury. That whole debate about identity and culture and how to find a path as both a Jew and a citizen of the world and a place might have been a luxury they thought they were going to have a chance to talk about in the 20s, and now think might simply be irrelevant. I hope that's sorry, but I'm sorry for such a negative answer.
No, your honest answers are wonderful. Did either of you have any closing comments you wanted to make?
Ken, closing comments?
Oh, well, really nothing except to say thank you again. And thank you again for taking this time in the context of lots of other very good reasons to be thinking about other things. Thank you, Steve. And I guess I would say maybe I'll turn around the last questioner's question and admit my own. And Steve, you said I ended the book in mid-sentence, and I think that's right, or maybe with just a kind of question mark or an uncertainty. I don't know to what degree the book speaks to our present. In many ways, it's easy for me to think about how my first book might have something to say about, for instance, the place we might want to have in our own lives as Jews of different languages, Jewish languages. This book also haunts me. I don't really know whether it offers a lesson, and I'd be curious to know from readers if you do find something.
Haunts you how? I mean, it's so much of modern Jewish historiography is built around ideologies that offer something of a solution. Yours is built around figures who, by and large, look past even the ideologies that they espouse and are grasping at something that isn't necessarily a solution, but that might be the best of all possible non-solutions. And so on some level, it's a book that wrestles not only with its topic, but also with the epistemology, the way in which we've actually understood or tried to understand the Jewish past. And that's one of the ways in which I think it continues to haunt even once one finishes it.
Thank you, Steve. As always, one should turn to one's teacher for the closing words.
One learns so much from one student. Thank you very much. This was a great pleasure on many different levels.
Thanks to all.
Thank you, Professor Zipperstein. Thank you, Professor Moss. For anyone curious to continue this conversation, I'd encourage you to purchase the book and read it yourself if you haven't done so already. We'll put the link here in the chat on Zoom, and we look forward to seeing you at future YIVO events to consider grappling with these big questions. Thank you.